So how might these issues translate into our context? You thought about the problems going on in the Roman church, and again, it's all with a view towards helping us understand the book of Romans. But as we think through these things, a lot of times we wonder, how do those principles and discussions translate into the modern day context? What if Paul is writing a letter to our churches today, or if I'm trying to apply Romans 14, how might it speak to my context in my church? So I think we can use Paul's particular issues as a blueprint. When we look at the issues he identified and how he addressed them, that gives us a template for translating it into our context. So once again, Romans 14 verse 1, where Paul says, "Except the one whose faith is weak, without quarreling over disputable matters." Paul identifies the issues in this chapter as disputable matters. And what that means is that they are not essential to the Christian faith. They are matters on which Christians can disagree. And sometimes the first step for students is just recognizing, okay, such a category exists. There is such a thing as disputable matters in the Christian faith. Now, the tricky thing, of course, with that description is it still begs the question, well, what matters are essential and non-essential? You know, can you give me a list for each category, or at least a really clear rubric for putting the right items in the right bucket? Well, once again, this is why I love the book of Romans. I'm not going to answer that question fully, but what I love about the book of Romans is it does help us answer that question. Because one of the other purposes of Romans, again, can't develop this in detail, but one of the other purposes of writing Romans was to show the Roman Christians what constituted the gospel. If we were to keep going into Romans 15, we'd hear Paul saying things like, I've finished work in one area, I want to go on to the next, and I would love you to be my jumping off point so that I can go do further missions work in lands beyond. And whenever a missionary comes to your church and wants support, what's one of the first questions you want to know? Can I trust this person? What do they believe? What are they going to do? And so a side purpose for Romans is he wants the Roman Christians to know this is the gospel I preach, so you can trust me and support me. So the more you study Romans and look at what Paul talks about, the better idea you will have of what constitutes the gospel, and thus what is an essential and non-essential matter. For now, just to give some answers to this question, here's some guiding principles that can help us identify disputable matters. So Paul has referred to food, holy days, and wine. Here's how these would connect with Jewish Christians. When it comes to the holy days, this was, or observance of them was, until Jesus is coming, God's law. The Pentateuch tells Israelites to observe certain Christian feasts and certain festivals. It tells them when, it tells them how. And so it is very likely, as we said earlier, that the Jewish Christians in the church at Rome grew up believing these things and believing that they were non-negotiable. So they believed the gospel, that yes, they became Christians, but the Mosaic law is still their religious background. So when you are told from day one, hey, if you want to live, do these things, and we're not presenting that as bad. I mean, that is how God structured the Mosaic covenant. But if you grow up believing that you must do those things, you don't just drop that from your conscience the moment you become a Christian. You don't just believe in Jesus and say, okay, now I know I'm free from the Mosaic covenant. I don't have to observe the ceremonies anymore. I'll just drop that right out of my practice and my conscience. It takes time to figure out the implications of the gospel and what that means for observance of the law. So perhaps a category for Romans 14 issues could be discerning which laws continue from Old Testament to New Testament. trying to discern, I should say, what's the unifying moral framework, a category we often used in Reformed discussions. What's the unifying moral framework that helps me move from old to new, that helps me translate what God said then to what God says now? What are my core ethics and my values as a Christian that help me navigate those conversations? Maybe another way to put it on the same category could be, all right, depending on how you were raised, the more aware you become of the Bible and the gospel, discerning, okay, what's God's law? What's God's will for me versus tradition? We're all raised with different traditions. We all breathe a certain cultural air, and we're trying to discern, okay, what is God's will versus man-made traditions, which is the distinction that the Protestant Reformation celebrates. As Christians, it's incumbent on us to do the work of thinking about the Bible and thinking about theology in order to answer the ethical question, what does God want me to do? Does God command this? So there's one category. And then when it comes to food and wine, again, they were probably avoiding it due to its association with paganism. And I want us to be careful. I think as moderns, it's easier for us to think, they're just so picky. They were just following their religious traditions. Let's keep in mind, in Israel's history, people died in order to be loyal to these associations. And I don't think they were misguided, but you can go read some of the literature that was written between the Old and New Testaments, times of persecution, where pagan kings are saying to them, just give up these Jewish traditions and you can live. Just make this sacrifice of an unclean animal and you can live. And that, when put in that framework, it was be loyal to God or be loyal to this oppressive, unjust, evil king. And they died out of loyalty to their God. And so those practices they turn into traditions about what you should avoid and how you don't want to contaminate yourself by, these pagan associations. And Jesus comes along and he says, okay, now you're free from that. You're free from the ceremonial laws. You're free from the laws that say you can't eat those foods. There's a reason people didn't react so favorably to that. And there is a sense in which saying, okay, we're all free from that. I know God said that, but now we're free from that. That is a ludicrous belief unless you believe that Jesus has abrogated the law. And the only way he has the authority to do that is if he rose from the dead, because he's God's Messiah. Now that's what we believe and celebrate as Christians. But that's the earth-shattering, life-reorienting event that came into these people's lives and caused them to rethink all these things. What does it mean to be loyal to God now that Jesus has come? And I just want us to appreciate, once again, thinking through all those implications and working them out in your conscience and in your ethical system and in your reading the Bible, that's just something that takes time. And so no group should say to the other group, I figured it out, get on board now, or it's your problem. You're going to be the one who has to suffer the discomfort. So just the principle I'm driving at here is, it's good for us to learn to recognize that some people differ and how strongly they view associations between certain activities and paganism. Just not every Christian creates as much difference as another. So those, I think, are two helpful categories. Discerning what is God's will. Am I making an appropriate, responsible use of Scripture to guide me in my obedience to God? And am I respecting the fact that it takes others time and space to work their understanding of the implications of the gospel? And maybe what's holding all this together, maybe what's just driving everything Paul says is, as you figure this out, recognize that other people in the assembly are not problems to be solved, but people to be loved. And if that ethic would guide the community, they could move towards healthy Christian living.